The brilliant one there.
I'll take it. This is a question for Dr. Craig. So it seems that both God and numbers are such that if they possibly exist, they necessarily exist. And this, of course, is an inference that's exploited in modal ontological arguments for God's existence. And to refute that argument, you got to show that God's existence is impossible by showing that the concept of God is incoherent. So wouldn't you need to show that the existence of numbers is impossible in a similar way in order to escape a parallel ontological argument for the existence of numbers?
Well, to escape the ontological argument, you don't have to refute the first premise, but just deny that it's been proven. You can have an undercutting defeater rather than a rebutting defeater. But in the case of Platonism, my principal objection against it would be theological, that it is contrary to the doctrine of Scripture, which is that God is the sole ultimate reality and therefore the creator of everything outside himself, and that this central tenet of Judaism and Christianity is fatally compromised by Platonism, and that would give you good reason for thinking that the existence of these uncreated objects is metaphysically impossible.
Come on. You, sir, the brilliant one.
For Dr. Koons, I believe Dr. Van Inwagen said something to the effect of, it's your view that there are non-existent objects and that I guess these are in a non-existent space somewhere, and you shook your head vigorously. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say some words in response.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's talk about the Cheshire Cat, I guess. So on the Reformed Mennonian view, right, the Cheshire Cat is not a cat, right, and doesn't occupy any region space. Okay? It's an entity which, if it existed, would be able to exist or would be able to vanish while leaving its smile behind, or something like that, right? So all those features that we would get from this story are features that are encased within a modal operator here, right? If it actually existed, then So I don't have to worry about running into any possible fat men in the doorway or anything like that, right? There aren't any, right? There are entities that, if they existed, would be fat men in the doorway. Some of them actually exist, so I'm a possible fat man in the doorway if I gain a little bit of weight and go to the doorway, right? But there are also non-existent things that could be fat men in the doorway as well, in my picture. But they're not actually fat or men or in the doorway, those non-existent things. I mean, it seems to me it should be sort of uncontroversial that there are properties that entail actual existence and properties that don't, right? So in some sense of relevance, actually existing, that's a property that entails actually existing. Not existing, that's a property that doesn't entail existing. So non-existing objects can have properties that don't entail actual existence. Occupying space is not one of those, but being thought of by me, or being a character in a story, those are non-existence entailing properties. So to get to Bill's
Why
point,
on earth would you say that the Cheshire Cat has a grin but isn't in space and time?
it doesn't have a grin. It would have a grin if it existed.
Is it? It's not a cat.
It's not a cat.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that's
Okay, my neo-Minoianism is too much based on Terry Parsons and too
that's
little
a
on
different
you.
one. So that's why I don't want to be lumped in with that view at all. This is a Grand Priest version. Right? It's quite different, I think. And so.
I withdraw my statement about that,
Okay. Yeah.
but nothing else.
Wow, this is a red letter day for me, actually.
Rob, it just occurred to me to apply this to what we're concerned about here, that this sounds rather similar to Jeffrey Hellman's modal structuralism, that if there were numbers, then 2 + 2 would equal 4, for example. It's a use of counterfactual counterfactuals to substitute for existence claims. Are you familiar with Hellman's work?
Some of that, yeah, it's similar. I wouldn't go exactly that way, because I don't think, well, I might, but in any case, there's definitely a similarity there, and in both cases, I think it requires it requires possible worlds occupied by things that don't actually exist, right? And de re facts about entities in those possible worlds, which we can refer to in this world. So in that sense, it's very similar.
Dr. Craig, at the beginning, Dr. Van Inwagen explained how he understood traditional Christian claims that God's the maker of the heavens and the earth, all that's seen and unseen. Could you say a little bit about what you think about the Bible rules that out?
Yes, in my book, God Overall, I provide a fairly detailed exegesis of a number of passages, like the prologue to the Gospel of John and several Pauline passages that I think indicate that God is the sole ultimate reality, the creator of everything other than himself. And it doesn't matter whether or not the authors of Scripture had the conception of abstract objects. What they did have the conception of is that God was the universal cause of everything apart from himself that existed, and that apart from him there was nothing that was uncreated. That is stated very clearly, I think, in Scripture. And then, provoked by Peter's codicil to the Nicene Creed that this only applies to causally related objects, I did some historical study of the ante-Nicene Church Fathers. And what I was surprised to discover was that leading up to Nicaea, there was a considerable discussion among the Church Fathers concerning the status of being agenitas, unoriginated or uncreated, and they were adamant that there is only one agenitas, and they explicitly rejected the views of Pythagoras and Plato that there were other agenita, like numbers or properties or things of that sort. So even if they didn't have Peter's conception of what a property is, it was clear that these ante-Nicene fathers were not willing to allow that there was anything, any agenitas, apart from God himself. And so that was the dual basis for my theological commitments. It's really interestingly related to the doctrine of the Trinity, isn't it? Because the idea was that the Father is agenitas, but the Son is genitas in the sense of begotten.
So in patristic times and or in biblical times, they held that God is the creator of everything that's non-identical to God?
Yeah, well, they held that everything apart from God has been created by God. Yeah.
That's what you said.
As do I. In context.
Hi, thanks. Tim Paul. I have on the same point that Dale just brought up, the Nicene Creed. This is meant as a second mode that Peter can, or second way Peter could go to give an account of what's going on with the creed. That's not the same one that he gave, but still gives him the same sort of result that he wants for it. And it's based on later church announcements on what the creed meant. So here's one. Of course, your mileage will vary, but this is from Lateran IV, a Catholic Ecumenical Council in 1215. And when they parse it, they say this: that is, God is the principle of all things, creator of all things invisible and visible, spiritual and corporeal, who by his almighty power at the beginning of time created nothing from nothing, both spiritual and corporeal creatures, that is to say, angelic and earthly. Sounds there like they're thinking of seen and unseen as corporeal and spiritual, or angelic and creaturely, or not creaturely, material. If that's the case, then given that it seems like this cubed root of 2, or whatever the example was you gave, Peter, isn't itself a spiritual thing or a corporeal thing, it seems like, at least as Lateran IV understood it, perhaps abstracta weren't intended to be the things being discussed when they said visible and invisible, or seen and unseen. So that's just a second way you might do it.
might worry about, say, Platonic forms. They're not what I call abstract objects, but they're not spiritual or corporeal substances either. It would certainly be heretical to say there were Platonic forms and God didn't create them. Aristotelian accidents. They're certainly not substances at all, because they're accidents. It would be heretical to say that they existed, but God didn't create them. But they're not what I'm calling abstract objects either.
Last time I tried to help you, Peter.
Well, the thing is, spiritual and corporeal substances were the things the church was worried about, because that's the kind of thing that your really serious heretics would try to assert the existence of. There are, what about uncreated energies? That's a phrase that turns up in some of the Greek fathers, and I've never quite understood what that meant, so if anybody can explain that, that would be interesting.
Question for Dr. Crane. He said something about putting stupid things and disgusting things out of mind. How does this square with God's omniscience? Does God stop being omniscient?
Was that for me? Yes. I couldn't quite hear. Could you repeat the question?
So when it comes to the silly things or stupid things.
Yes.
And God putting those out of his mind.
Yeah.
What does that imply about his omniscience? If anything.
Conceptualism requires that everything that God knows is an occurrent thought in his mind so that it can serve as the referent for these abstract terms. But the doctrine of omniscience does not require that everything that God knows he has occurrent thoughts about. I know the multiplication table up to 12, but I'm not thinking about any of those things. But for conceptualism, you've got to have these thoughts actually being occurrent in God's mind, not simply known to him via his omniscience. And then it is hard to understand why God would keep on thinking about horrible, vile things. I could give illustrations, but I don't want to. Just imagine that he or Jesus would be engaged in vile activities. Surely he would put these things out of mind rather than just keep thinking about them.
But he would still know them in a sense.
Excuse me?
He would still know them in a sense.
Yes, oh, of course. Yeah, he knows all these true propositions.
I don't
Yes.
see why that option's not available to a conceptualist too. Just doesn't think about certain things, so he doesn't have to.
I'm having difficulty hearing the gentleman.
So why doesn't the conceptualist have that same way out to?
Because he needs concrete entities to serve as the reference. That's the whole point. We should ask Tom's board about this. He needs these as the reference for abstract object terms, not just propositions that God knows, because then you're back to abstracta again. You need thoughts.
Peter, so can you explain within your view what are the objects of singular propositions? So Timmy believes that Santa Claus is on his roof, and so he doesn't believe something about a proposition or merely a property. So what is the object of his belief, or is the belief not singular?
You mean,
Santa Claus is on the roof.
oh, I see. You
So
just
not
asked,
the truth or falsehood of it.
what is the referent of the term?
What's the intentional object?
Probably a creature, childhood legend or something like that.
So, but
I doubt it was Nicholas of Smyrna.
Wouldn't you say it's an abstract object, just like a fictional character, like Sherlock
Right,
Holmes?
it is, that's why I said, not a creature of fiction, but maybe a creature of childhood, tales or something like that.
Now, he wouldn't give you that answer, like the Timmy wouldn't.
Well, no, so, can't you be mistaken about what the objects of your, thought are? So, Robin Hood is thinks he's aiming at a deer, but it's actually a fortuitous pattern of light and shadow that happens to counterfeit the appearance. So he isn't aiming at anything, but he thinks he's aiming at a deer. So Timmy isn't, or maybe it is a fake deer. Robin Hood is aiming at a papier-mâché mock-up of a deer, which he thinks is a real deer.
But why treat this example differently than Timmy's thoughts about his deceased uncle?
Well, I believe his deceased uncle still exists. So
But- Okay. But if his deceased uncle didn't exist, would his thought be about a fiction?
well, you could also have a perfectly good thought that is about nothing. That is, if I'm, I think that just as Robin is aiming at nothing, he's not aiming at a pattern of light and shadow, I think. That would be wrong. He's just not, there's just isn't, he's performing the action of aiming, but it has no object.
All right, so actually, we're out of time, but I wanted to end, Professor Evans, would you like to, we'll end with your question.
Well, it's maybe a very naive question. I don't claim to be a mathematician or know very much about mathematics. But this is a question for Dr. Craig. It always strikes me that one criterion of reality is that when we encounter something that's real, it can surprise us. When we do science, we look for the facts. Sometimes we do an experiment, it doesn't come out right. But it seems to me that when we do mathematics, we have that same feeling sometimes, that we're not just inventing things or making up things, we're discovering facts. And we have a sense that we're exploring the world. That seems to me to point towards realism. I just wondered what Dr. Craig would say about that sense.
What I would say is that might be a good criticism to make of fictionalism, which is another anti-realist alternative that we have not discussed today. The fictionalist would say that mathematical statements like 2 + 2 = 4, since they are ontologically committing to abstract objects, are not true. They are false. And you might say, but that's implausible because mathematics is a realm of discovery. We're often surprised. But for a neutralist, for example, or an ultima facie strategist, we would affirm mathematical truth and therefore would agree that as you explore the theorems of your axiomatic set theory, you might often be surprised at the results. And this will be a journey of discovery in which new truths are uncovered. So not all anti-realist positions are incompatible with mathematical truth, and that's all that's needed for your point about being surprised and having a journey of discovery.